Today in the EU elections, the influence of Eastern Europe on Brussels politics.
The European elections.
Eastern enlargement.
Visegrad 4 group.
The Visegrad 4.
Northern and Southern Europe.
Central and Eastern Europe.
Much has transformed over the past 2 decades. The Union has evolved and expanded, with numerous countries joining its rank. Following the 2004 European Big Bang, the Union expanded rapidly, altering Europe's geopolitical landscape. While expansion has slowed since then, relatively new member states continue to influence and shape the EU's agenda and policies. In this episode, we're looking at east of Brussels. Hello and welcome. I am Evi Kiori, and this is Geography of the EU Vote and Influence, a mini-series from Today in the EU, where we decode EU regions' influence on EU politics, identify challengers and outliers, while uncovering differences between North and South, East and West of Europe ahead of the parliamentary elections in June. To look at the East, we're joined by Alexandra Brzosowski, Euractiv's Global Europe editor. Alex, Eastern European and especially the Baltic countries have become quite visible over the past 2 years. How do you look at this development?
So they have been visible before, but maybe not as influential as they have become now. I won't tell you anything new when I say that Ukraine really shifted the EU center of gravity eastwards, at least for the past 2 years when it comes to EU foreign and security policy. And here it's not only about their voices being heard in the decision-making.
Right, so what's the essence then?
When you speak to diplomats from the region, most of them don't overemphasize the fact that they've always been right on Russia and defense all along. It's not about rubbing this in so much, but more about the fact that they now feel that bigger member states that for long have been the motor of EU decision-making, like France, Germany, and to some extent also the Benelux and other countries, can't ignore their concerns anymore.
But in that regard, looking at Robert Fico's Slovakia and Viktor Orban's Hungary, which tend to be the two very obvious irritants in Brussels, the Baltics have been the success story of enlargement. Is that correct?
It's true that in many ways the Baltics have been the poster children of EU enlargement policy. They adhere to the democratic values, comply with international legal agreements most of the time, have so far avoided big political shocks like we've seen in Hungary and Poland, and above all, always support EU decisions.
And could you give us an example that illustrates this difference?
A good example for that has been, for example, migration. We've seen the massive criticism the management of the migrant crisis has received both in the Baltics and across Eastern Europe. But there's a big difference between the Baltic states and Visegrad countries that have said that they will not accept migrants. So the Baltics have said that they do not like the decisions, but they will abide by them and will abide by the agreed rules. So in a way, that has given them also more credibility to ask and lead on other policy issues. And yes, some in Brussels might say they're punching above their weight, which is probably true, but it's not necessarily seen as a bad thing.
And it almost feels like the Baltics negotiate in a more subtle way than the Polish and the Hungarians, especially with Brussels. Now, the reason why this is happening is up for debate, of course, but it almost feels like the Baltics remaining united, while knowing that they are small countries with little influence and little voice, is crucial when it comes to achieving and pushing Brussels for policies that comply with national interests. But Alex, the shift in Eastern European influence has been especially visible in the case of Ukraine. Even Emmanuel Macron is feeding into it since recently. What can we take away from this?
Yes, that's for sure. But it's not only Ukraine, but also the whole Eastern Partnership issue. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, both Germany and France took a long time to see how to approach the new situation.
Et nous avons la conviction, en effet, que la défaite de la Russie est indispensable à la sécurité et la stabilité en Europe.
The defeat of Russia is necessary for security and stability in Europe. What's at stake here is, on the one hand, the war in Ukraine, but also the ability of Europeans to finally define their collective security, mentioned Emmanuel Macron this past February.
And in retrospect, when you ask Brussels people, they are now saying that, thank God we had the Russia hawks who had a plan and knew what should be done all along. So Macron's Eastern Zeitenwende can be also a bit seen as a different story, though.
In what sense do you mean this?
So when you ask French officials, for them, this has not so much to do with the pressure from other partners like the Baltics, but rather a bit more about the serious reassessments of security threats for Europe.
Que notre Europe aujourd'hui est mortelle. Elle peut mourir.
We must be clear about the fact that today our Europe is mortal. It can die and it all depends on our choices. These choices have to be made now, said Emmanuel Macron during his Sorbonne speech in late April, where he urged EU to support Ukraine.
And that you can see happening across the board. So be it neutral Nordic countries joining NATO, countries discussing conscription and preparedness, or the EU moving towards creative ways to ensure funds for Ukraine. So it's not only the Eastern European influence. I think it's a general shift that you see. Mm-hmm. But what is true is that a lot of pressure has been coming from the Eastern Europeans that has been taken into account.
Mm-hmm, that is true. I think Western leaders, especially when they were led by former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, pursued a strategy of commercial and political accommodation with Vladimir Putin, something that we saw failing massively with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But currently, it's very important to understand the background of this Eastern shift and what does that mean in the current election context.
It for sure means that Eastern Europeans will not be easily ignored when it comes to the distribution of top jobs this time. But also, not only the top jobs, but high-level positions inside institutions in general. I think we've all seen these reports that in many ways Eastern Europeans are underrepresented. That goes also for the Nordics and other regions. But considering that they have joined the EU 20 years ago, that has been a constant theme when we were looking at those things. And it's true, many of the Eastern European member states have been members of the EU and NATO for 20 years or more. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't so far really reflected in those positions. Maybe with the exception of Poland's Donald Tusk, who got the European Council job. But other than that, we've not seen many top jobs filled.
That's one example only. But, you know, one of the hot contenders is Estonia's Prime Minister Kaja Kallas. What are her chances, let's say, for the EU top diplomat position?
So listening around Brussels, better than 2 years ago. And she might have a good shot, especially since EU leaders might likely look for a liberal rather than a socialist for that position this time around, especially since the socialists will aim for the European Council, as it seems. And if the conservatives keep the Commission, that setup politically would open the way for her. There's not many liberals that could take the position. There's also not many female liberals that could take the position. So that plays in her favor. But vice versa, it's not only about the EU top jobs.
Right. What else can we expect?
What will be interesting to see this time around will be how the College of Commissioners will be composed by whoever will be the president, be it Ursula von der Leyen or someone else, especially when it comes to that geographical balance and especially when it comes to the distribution of portfolios where Eastern Europeans could play a big role. It's almost certain that it will need to be reflected somehow. Also because they have become more confident in asking for those portfolios.
Could you give us some examples?
We saw the Polish foreign minister who very vocally has been campaigning for either the defense commissioner job, if it happens, or other positions that, feed well into Poland's demands for portfolios. So it will be very interesting to see how they, in the next few weeks, voice that demand. And how it can be accommodated in the end.
And what about the accusation that Baltics might be too hawkish for the position?
I think, frankly, we're slowly moving beyond that. The Baltic states, yes, have been hawkish when it comes to sanctions or the push to hold Russia accountable for its war crimes in Ukraine, but arguably they're not far off from the consensus anymore. So, I mean, looking at the EU 2 years ago, we're speaking about it as a self-described peace project. And today, the EU is jointly purchasing ammunition for Kiev, looking for ramping up defense production and moving towards war economy. And also, when you hear Western European defense chiefs being worried about a war with Russia in the next decade, I think we've really moved away from this very big separation of hawkish Easterners and Western, voice of reason.
I think it's clear that there is a sort of consensus there now.
So in many ways, the Baltic position has been the most consistent one. And in many cases, Eastern Europeans have been providing the solutions to some of the issues we had, right? It was Estonia that came up with the ammunition plan in the first place. The Czechs are spearheading their own initiative at the moment. So many Eastern European countries are seemingly better prepared for what might be coming in the next few years. And especially when it comes to issues like resilience, they use favorite catchword that, well, nobody really knew what it means. Well, it seems like they are the ones prepared at the moment when it comes to fighting disinformation better than others, maybe. So there's a lot they can bring to the table. The question is more, how ready are Western Europeans to accept the power shift in practice? And especially when you look around, they have also moved quite a lot in the past 2 years. So the time might be right to really take that into consideration this time.
Let's stay on this a little bit longer, because what you're saying is crucial, especially when it comes to how ready are Western Europeans to accept this shift regarding power. What's your gut feeling on this?
It seems they moved quite a lot. When we look again at Macron, I think part of that is also accepting that there needs to be a certain power sharing within the EU. When we look at Scholz, maybe a bit more hesitant than still to be expected. But again, I think that's why the geographical balance this time is so important, because many of the Western European countries have shifted, and they've shifted more towards the Eastern European position, arguably. Not everybody would agree on that, but I think that's the general view we have at the moment.
Thank you very much, Alex. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed or followed us yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. Also, make sure to leave a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews really help us to spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Nicoleta Yonta and myself. Thank you for tuning in. We will be with you again tomorrow morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.